So yeah, let's dig into it. Thank you everyone for being here. I'll be presenting my thesis, Common Ground, which has been a project that explores the intersection of agriculture, environment, and politics in India. And so it's really using the Mandi system as a focal point. So just a brief overview of the Mandi system for many who may not know. But it's essentially a system of government-run wholesale markets in which farmers will sell their produce into these markets and receive a minimum support price for it. So essentially, a price set out by produce and agricultural market committees to guarantee a fair price for all farmers. So I'm going to start off with this. This is just a breakdown of where we're going to go. This doesn't cover all of my thesis, but the parts that Professor Campbell and Professor Andelson and I thought were most important. So we'll start with the origins, the colonial history of the system, go into a little bit of the ecological breakdown the system really incentivizes. Then we'll kind of dig into the policy reform and the challenges there. This is kind of what started it all. I didn't talk to my advisors about this very much, but my first night in India, I actually came across a yellow barrier like those that you're seeing in this photo. And that was really where I had my first question, which is, what are these barriers doing? What are they left from? Why are they just abandoned, kind of carelessly throughout the city of Delhi? And so that answer is actually that they're remnants of farmer protest. So that's the first time I heard about the Mandi system and what really prompted me to dig into it. So going way back, the Mandi system was actually established to ensure stable cotton prices for the British when India was a British colony, so specifically to fuel the textile industry in Manchester. And so you can first see that it was actually established, within the 1800s, which shocked me when I found that out, that it was that old. And so it really kind of began in actually the state of Maharashtra in 1886. From there, there's a few different acts that you can see. So one of them being the Cotton and Grain Market Act of '87 that allowed colonial officials to designate areas as markets, known as mandis. And so within that, the British obviously had control of the people and the land of India in this market setting. Obviously, the Mandi system was established as a very extractive and exploitative system in which the British were really trying to keep prices as low for their own purposes as possible. After that, we see a little bit of a shift in the purpose that the Mandi was serving. And so post-independence, there was a series of acts in which the APMCs, or Agricultural Produce Market Committees, were established. So now the power went back to the Indian people, in which these committees were established, and Indians themselves were running the markets. From there, there's a transition to these systems of minimum support prices in which the farmers were trying to guarantee fair prices for themselves, especially given in the context of a lot of farmers in India are smallholders, owning less than 1 acre of land. From there, at the same time, it's important to consider that the Green Revolution was something that was taking place at this time. So there were a number of challenges that were happening throughout the 60s, including famine and drought. Two notable examples to certainly be thinking about that are relevant are the Bihar grain output that fell significantly from 7.5 million tons to 4.3 in the span of 1 year in the 60s. That caused enormous, public health crises, as you can imagine, but also really gained global attention for the importance of high-yield variety seeds. And so that was kind of the revolution that began, in which a lot of Western influences came to India in order to test out these new high-yield hybrid seeds. Yeah, as a result, it came with significant trade-offs. There was over 100,000 rice varieties that were lost that were believed to be indigenous. So that brings about a number of issues, including susceptibility to disease, susceptibility to different climate issues. So now that it's more of a monoculture and these new yields are improving, there's also significant risk associated with that. Yeah. So after this period, many systems worked relatively well for a large amount. They were considered to be in their kind of golden era in the 90s, but shortly after, they began to kind of decrease, and so there's a number of reasons behind that. Here you can see kind of Green Revolution associated fertilizer increases. So benefit of the green revolution, obviously yields are increasing. There's also kind of input costs that are increasing as well, being fertilizers. So yeah, definitely there's a lot of crops in India that are very fertilizer intensive, cotton being one of them. So that's important to know. Yeah, here we can see system stagnation, as I mentioned. They really peaked in the 1990s and began to go down into the 2000s. And so a reason for that is that simply the infrastructure of the Mandi system couldn't keep up with the yields that were happening. So obviously, when there's a lack of space, farmers begin to sell outside of the system. And when that happens, they don't have the protection that the Mandi system provides them with. So that means poor access, exploitation, and an overall lack of legitimacy in the system, which is not good. So while the Mandi now serves as protection, it's definitely inefficient and inaccessible for a lot of people. Awesome. So from here, we're going to move a little bit into the ecological breakdown. So we've had a good, hopefully, starting ground now for what the system is, the issues it has, and the history that it came from. So, what really happens when the system starts to poison the very land it depends upon is really where we want to go. So from here, we need to look at the hidden cost. One I'm going to focus on specifically is the loss of groundwater. So as you can see, agriculture consumes an overwhelming amount of fresh water in India, at least 80%. And specifically, the north that I focused on throughout my thesis is an area that is, an extra amount exploitative of groundwater. So there's over 19 million pumps that are used through subsidized electricity in northern India. I'll go into this a little bit more, but the crop selection that northern India uses requires a lot of irrigation, and so that requires a lot of groundwater. But yeah, you can see there's exploitation and a lot of water tables are falling rapidly. And, this is kind of all exacerbated by climate change when you're thinking about changing monsoon patterns, as well as the higher temperatures that will increase rates of evaporation. Yeah, so it's estimated that actually the current groundwater extraction rates we're seeing, which are already very bad, could even triple by 2080, which is very, very scary. Yeah, from here we can see this a little bit better. So if we're looking at in terms of groundwater loss that is happening, you'll see it's very, very concentrated in northern India, which is the area I was looking at. Coincidentally, northern India is also the area in which the Mandi system is actually continuing to work at the most efficient rate. So other areas of the nation have kind of experienced more loss of system infrastructure than the north has. So yeah, definitely very, very concerning. You can see the capital here, Delhi, the small little circle up here. Oh, I don't know if I'm quite tall enough. And then Haryana just south and west of it. Yeah, so along with irrigation comes soil salinization. So very, very bad. Essentially, when land is over-irrigated, it leads to salt buildup. One reason for that is that the soil itself in northern India is naturally containing relatively high levels of salt to begin with. But also, obviously, the huge extraction that's happening is making that much worse. So there's already 147 million hectares of degraded land. You can see respectively which is salt affected and which is waterlogged. But yeah, it's believed that this is probably very underreported as well. So yeah, I would not be surprised if it's much more. So if current trends continue along with climate change, up to 50% of arable land actually could be damaged by 2050 in India. Very concerning considering that the population is continuing to skyrocket, and so food security definitely looks to be an issue if that continues as projected. Along with health risks, it's important to acknowledge that irrigation dependence definitely increase. The things including malaria, dengue, and Japanese encephalitis, all mosquito-borne illnesses that the stagnant water that irrigation provides, could increase breathing rates as well as infection rates. And so that was an area that I, really enjoyed working on, especially with Dr. Campbell right now, taking a seminar in disease and the impacts of climate change. So yeah, very interesting kind of side effects that I feel like are not often thought about when you're talking about agriculture. Aside from that, it's important to know about the ways in which irrigation-dependent crops are also then transitioning to the air. So in northern India, paddy farming or rice farming is a big thing. So along with irrigation, there's also stubble burning. There's 3 distinct agricultural seasons in India. The end of Kharif, which is the summer season, is actually when rice stubble is burnt. And so in this season, farmers often, due to a lack of equipment and a lack of time to prepare for the next season, have to burn their fields in order to, get all that excess stubble away. So this is actually a significant contributor to the air pollution that Delhi experiences in the fall. So aside from holidays and the cooler temperatures that trap smoke down lower, it's also this stubble burning that is contributing to really, really bad air quality. This past fall, Delhi's air quality index hit 359, but it's routinely hitting 7 times WHO safe limits, which is really, really scary. Yeah, this is just yet another reason why Delhi is, routinely rated as one of the worst air polluted cities in the world. Yeah, here you can see, pretty jarring, but you can actually see the Kharif burning from space. This is a photo from NASA in October, which is when Kharif season is, and so, yeah, obviously just to better understand the scale and the scope of this air pollution, it's, visible from thousands and thousands of miles away. Yeah, so here, just going back to this paradox in which northern India is the most infected by many environmental effects of agriculture, such as soil salinization, groundwater loss, as I mentioned, but it's also the area where the Mandi system is working the best. Here you can see the density of Mandis by state. So up here, Haryana, Punjab, you can see the highest density pretty much of anywhere in India. So very important, and that's also a big reason why the reforms, which I'll go into in a little bit, were so controversial in northern India. Yeah, so leading right into that, here you can see just a general poll by Pew of the political, opinions of India. So politics in India are, pretty complicated, and I definitely don't think I have a full grasp of them after this project. But essentially, the BJP, which is the party in power run by Prime Minister Modi, is very dominant. But despite that, right now, the mass majority of results, regardless of political affiliation, have, quite a bit of distrust in the system. So I'll let you read it for yourselves, but the majority are thinking politicians are corrupt, majority are thinking that elections don't really matter in terms of outcome, as well as a variety of other things. So yeah, definitely important to think about and consider in terms of what reform would look like. Going into here, as I mentioned, going all the way back to that first barrier I saw, reform has been tried with the Mandi system to improve it, to encourage farmers to have better livelihoods and to encourage the land to be treated in a more sustainable way. But there's definitely barriers to that, and that's seen in the response to these 3 laws. So first of all, I'll let you read them yourselves, but there was the first law that essentially allowed farmers to sell produce outside of these markets, enabling private trade. The second was a law that legalized contract farming, in which farmers and private buyers could determine their own relationships. And the third was a limit on essential commodity stocking, so essentially in which buyers can store some food for later to keep more price stability. And so all of these, I think the general fear among farmers was, based on my reading and literature, that farmers are grasping and they don't want any part of the system to kind of disperse, because the ultimate fear is that in the long run MSP will go away and they won't have these price kind of safety nets to uphold them. You can see definitely why this fear would be validated in terms of looking at the rural wages and the ways in which farmers are already becoming more desperate economically. Obviously, correlation doesn't equal causation. You can see the pandemic was here in the middle of the graph. But overall, based on all the literature I read, even without the pandemic, these real wages in terms of adjusting for inflation and so on are trending upwards. So yeah, very serious to consider. Yeah, so after these 3 laws were introduced, there was a wide response, something that I found really, really compelling. And so over 500,000 farmers, likely more, as this isn't a thing that's easily reported, were protesting, and there were hundreds and hundreds of deaths due to harsh conditions, as well as COVID, as these protesters were essentially camping along the highways entering Delhi. So yeah, conveniently, Prime Minister Modi walked back those 3 laws we just saw just before a key election in 2021. But it was over 18 months of these protests taking place. Yeah, so in terms of what next, considering all the nuances and the differences that North India is experiencing compared to the rest of the country, it definitely seems like maintaining the Mandi system to some extent is the way to go in northern India. Specifically, the modernization of infrastructure so that all the produce can actually be sold inside the market, So bringing that back, as well as expanded MSPs that are actually incentivizing farmers to do crops that are suitable for the climate over here in India. So rather than using these Green Revolution rice and wheat that were introduced that are irrigation dependent in the land that is somewhere drier than the ideal conditions for rice and paddy would be really, really essential. That includes going back to traditional crops such as millets, which India has significantly transitioned away from after the Green Revolution. There's also, so many possibilities for digitalization of the system, especially when thinking about an already existing ENOM, which is the International National Agricultural Market, that's electronically, which is the E. So in terms of digital pricing transparency, making sure farmers actually know what the prices are, and that way they can't be corrupted as easily is really, really important. But along with that, there's obviously different training that needs to happen to ensure that farmers are able to actually benefit from the different digitalization that's possible. Yeah, there's also farmer producer organizations, FPOs, that can help to promote local autonomy and scale. So helping farmers, actually train each other in terms of digital literacy, as well as different, just price knowledge is definitely beneficial in avoiding corruption. Yeah, other than that, there's already pilot forms that are happening, and after the political urgency that's really represented by that first 2020 protest, it's definitely important, and it's already happening, I believe. Yeah, outside of the north, obviously, it's looking a little bit different because there's already such low Mandi infrastructure, as we saw by the density map. I think the hope of restoring the Mandi system is a lot less likely. So yeah, there's a lot of reasons for that, but essentially without the Mandi system, what really needs to happen is more forms of rural credit, more forms of rural availability, especially for marginalized farmers that includes women as well as elites. So yeah, various different initiatives that should happen there. Yeah, but that's about it from me. Hopefully a brief, understandable overview. I'm happy to answer anything to this. Yes.
Okay, what was your favorite? Oh, well, great presentation. I really enjoyed it. It was really fascinating. It's been really cool to see you grow throughout this entire year. But what was your favorite part, of your research?
That's a really good question. I think favorite. I think one of the most interesting things to me were the ways in which the response to Mandi reform in northern India was so united, in a way that I think would be different, very distinct from any other aspects, in terms of the ways in which people were united across caste, across class. There was such a united response that really showed the cultural influence of the Mandi as well as the economic influence. So that was good. In terms of actually being in India, also I think experiencing these physical marketplaces myself was something that was really cool, and definitely hammered home the idea that these markets have so much cultural importance as well as economic and ecological importance. So, yeah. Good question. Yes.
All the projections are that El Nino years will become more and more frequent and maybe last longer with shorter intervals. And El Nino years inevitably coincide with droughts on the Indian subcontinent. How would this almost inevitable, unstoppable climate change, would these reforms manage to cope with that?
Yeah. Certainly. I think that's something that should be definitely ingrained into the government apparatus and thinking about what crops do we want to incentivize for which regions. I think that adds extra importance to making sure that we're not trying to do irrigation dependent crops in climates that aren't going to be feasible right now, let alone in 20 years. So yeah, I think kind of cutting those roots before they grow too deep is really, really important in terms of Yes.
Why do you think the Mandi systems are less present in South India? Is it just because it's less of an agricultural zone?
Yeah, that's a great question. What I came across when I was looking into that was, first of all, I think the proximity to the capital is definitely important to think about. I think just because it's closer, it's lasted longer. Also, I think in terms of a green revolution impact, yeah, northern India was radically transformed in a way that many other parts of India weren't, in terms of especially the wheat and rice kind of transition to dependence on those crops were a big one too. Yes.
Do you see people wanting to return to growing traditional crops? And is there something that can be done to, what is preventing this? And is there something the government could do to encourage it?
Yeah, no, definitely. So I think there's a few different aspects in terms of what the government is actually doing, for example, to, you know, persuade or not persuade farmers to transition back to millets. Is that, you know, I think to some extent, there's a lack of, you know, memory at this point of those crops. And I think that's, you know, almost intentionally so. Looking at it from like a sociological or anthropological standpoint, you know, colonialism is kind of intentionally trying to do that. And so I think that's important to consider too. Otherwise, in terms of incentives, you know, obviously, when wanting to be a global economy, you would assume the government in India would prioritize what is going to make them the most money. And so that makes sense. Yeah, but I definitely think there's room for, you know, the return of the millet to be incentivized at the government level in terms of, like I was saying, you know, increasing MSP programs for it, increasing awareness of it. Just, I think 2023 was year of the millet by the UNFAO, and so there's definitely increasing awareness of it. And I think that's a road that still needs to grow. Yes?
How about the comparative yields of those millets and pulses?
Yeah.
Traditional compared to paddy and wheat.
In terms of yields, like per...
Well, let's say in terms of nutrient output.
Yeah, definitely. Millets are known to be incredibly nutritionally dense. Actually, a reason for the transition was that after the Green Revolution, it became more of like an animal fodder crop. They're actually commonly used for, you know, animals now, which I think is a little bit of the reason for like the cultural work that's gonna have to be done in order to make people think of millets as people food again. But you know, nutritionally, millets are very, very dense. I believe in some reasons, I think they could be even more nutrition beneficial than rice. Yeah. So, yeah, they're great. I love them. Highly recommend eating millets. If you've never tried them, they're really nice.
I have another question. One of the tragic manifestations of the stress that the farmers have been experiencing is suicide. You addressed this in the thesis. You didn't really talk about it here. I wonder if you could say a word about that.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I don't know if I have the exact number off the top of my head, but yeah, between, you know, the late 90s and 2018, yeah, there have been, I want to say, excess of 400,000.
That's what your thesis said.
Of 400,000 farmer suicides, which is, you know, yeah, very intense. And thinking about it, definitely from an economic standpoint, you know, the rising levels of indebtedness that are happening for smallholders, as well as kind of, I think, the rural hopelessness that is happening, and feelings of kind of, I don't know, politically not having really a say. So I think that's definitely important to consider. But I think it's also to acknowledge that, you know, the context of Mandi protests aren't new in the world. There have been a number of farmer protests, a number of farm crises. You can think of the U.S., you know, the 1980s farm crisis, which also had significant levels of farmer suicides. And so, yeah, it's not something new. I think, you know, into the 21st century, there's a lot of countries that are going to be experiencing these really kind of political and charged agricultural questions. And so, yeah, I don't think that's unique to India at all. I think that's something they'll continue to evolve. Yeah. Yes.
I know you mentioned something about the digitization of like agricultural systems,
Yeah.
and like the way that you can communicate prices to the farmer directly.
Yeah.
So personally, I've always seen like the Indian government use digitization as a way of just like masking like an overall system that might be just as dysfunctional as it. So
Yeah.
like I'm just curious as to what your thoughts have been on what you've seen so far about the like, new digital system and whether it's been effective or even if it's been implemented.
Absolutely. So I definitely agree with that. I think enom is not enough. I totally agree with you in that just digitalizing the price systems that we already have isn't going to significantly decrease corruption. I think what intrigues me and fascinates me the most about the digitalization of the price systems is the opportunities for entrepreneurship, specifically in farmers and young people that are going to be able to create their own platforms to educate other farmers about the price systems. I think that's something that's could be a really, really interesting tool. Other than that, I think aspects of enom that are also, could carry a bit more power, like I think you're getting to, is that I think there's opportunities that should be made during throughout the enom process in which agricultural produce market committee members can actually be rewarded for not being corrupt. So I think some sort of feedback or authentication system in which actually people who are not doing corrupt work within the committee could be rewarded. So I think that's something with enom that should be taking place. I don't know what that looks like in terms of, in terms of it, but that's something about enom that I was reading a lot about, and something that I think, based on what I know, I think could, significantly reduce that corruption. Just not digitalize it and make it a new avenue for corruption. Yeah. Yes.
I'm assuming the food we just ate had wheat
Yes, probably.
and no millet and no pulse, whatever pulse is.
Correct, yeah.
What is a pulse?
A pulse? Yes. What's the best example of a pulse?
Beans.
Yeah, like a bean.
Oh, okay. Is there an international market for millets and pulses?
That's a great question. I haven't looked into that too much, but I definitely have eaten millets throughout India, although I will say they're obviously less common than some of the foods we now associate with India. Going back, obviously, I think colonialism has been a big part of that since the 60s, that transition away from millets and kind of cultivating the palate of Indian food away from millets is another thing. In terms of other countries that I know are using millets, I haven't heard of too many. I believe, and sometimes in China, especially in rural communities, millets are also consumed, but that's really the only one I've looked into. That's a great question. Yeah. Yes,
What originally drew you to be interested in India and to want to travel there and
yeah.
continue to dig so deep?
Absolutely. So for me, for me in really declaring my independent major, what interests me the most is the ways in which kind of ancient land use systems can be changed and molded to fit 21st century kind of needs. And so with that being said, I got these two on board for that, and I didn't really know exactly the region I was going to focus on. Definitely when I was declaring my major my second year. But my opportunity in India last year kind of presented itself naturally after a previous internship, and so I heard about them. I heard they were doing great work, and I was definitely passionate about seeing really good on the ground rural development happen. And so that was kind of that, and I had no idea that that internship would lead to this topic, but it kind of naturally did. Immediately, kind of like I said, I got off the airplane around 1 a.m. in Delhi, and the foundation driver picked me up, and we were pretty much, out of Delhi by that point, and we came across one of these yellow berries I showed on the board. And I was just like, what on earth is this raggedy thing doing in the middle of the road that everyone's kind of swerving around? And he explained it to me briefly about why I was there from protest, and I was like, oh, that's really interesting. I kind of want to go look into that, and so it kind of became a rabbit hole, and then that rabbit hole became a little research project and an email to these two shortly after. So, yeah,
Cool.
happened naturally, I would say. Yes.
With the shift that we're kind of hoping to happen with the different cereals from rice to millet, is that more within India or internationally, kind of like how quinoa got to be huge?
Definitely. I mean, I think an international shift could certainly be beneficial, especially considering like I was saying earlier, the nutritional density that millets have. In a lot of ways, they are kind of better for you than rice is. They're also, like I was getting at earlier, they're a lot less water intensive. So So, yeah, I would say international. I couldn't imagine being a bad idea just off the top of my head, but yeah, I certainly think they're a food for the future, if you will. I think they're something that has a lot of growth. Yeah. Good question. Yes.
In terms of like the industrial or commercial processing of the grains, do those facilities still exist or exist in a way that they could be processed for human consumption?
For millets? Yes, that is a fantastic question. I am aware of, just my time there seeing different processing facilities. I definitely think, that infrastructure has certainly deteriorated since millets were a staple crop, because it's been, pushing 60 years since those were really phased out. So, yeah, I think that will be a barrier for sure in terms of increasing millet consumption. But I think it's there, and certainly I think in the long run they'll actually be a lot more cost effective in terms of, the alternatives, which are continuing to subsidize water, that gets harder and harder to extract. So, yeah. Absolutely, good question. Yes?
Do the farmers grow some of their own food and use it there, and then grow other food to sell?
Certainly.
And if that's the case, could you encourage them to try millets at home
Yeah.
and pulses?
Certainly.
And eventually
yeah.
it would spread?
Yeah, definitely. So, since many farmers are smallholders, there's definitely a lot of them who are farming for subsistence. Yeah, I think that kind of gets back to how do you totally change the perception of millets from an animal crop to a human one. I think is a major undertaking.
And for me, it's bird seed, and the birds don't even like it.
Yes, but yeah, I think that's another thing too. Like, I try to be very aware of in my policy recommendations as a Westerner. I think that's important to be aware of in terms of who. Yeah, definitely. I don't think it's a good approach to have outsiders coming in telling Indians what to feed themselves. So, yeah. Yes.
For the group, out of curiosity, who has had millet?
Where did you find it? I love to try it.
Yeah, I was a dietetic major, so we had to eat like everything in our food science class. But you can buy it like outfit mill.
Oh, okay.
I think McNeil is best.
You can just use a rice cooker to make it. It's pretty easy.
Totally a millet. Yeah. No, definitely. Thanks so much for the questions. If there aren't any else, yes.
So I was just like quickly Googling to make sure that I'm like not thinking something out of nowhere. But like my perception in India has always been millets is like sort of this like healthy, like like the like when they like make a food item like, oh, this is so much better for you than anything else.
Yeah.
Like that's been my perception, and I think that India is a country with a lot of like persistent hunger problems.
Yeah.
And this is what I googled: productivity of rice being a lot more per acre. Like that's where I think so my question comes to you is like, I guess it's not really a question, it's more of like a, what do you think?
Absolutely. That's an important question. In terms of productivity per acre, I think it's important to consider too that in rice cultivation, particularly in the north, productivity per acres would be dropping anyway, especially considering the impacts on the soil that are already happening in terms of salinity. So I think that's important to acknowledge, and definitely I think that's a really pivotal question that India will certainly need to address. But in terms of like the marketing of millets and who they are being marketed to, like you were saying with health food, I think that's something that I guess will need to be really strategic, and I hope it happens definitely in terms of like yeah, in terms of water use. I don't think, rice needs to be completely phased out, but in terms of the north, it certainly needs to decrease at this point, or at this rate. Or alternatively, irrigation practices need to be much more efficient than they are. Yeah, but it's a great question. Yeah. Yes.
How do you fix salty soil?
Yeah. Well, so one strategy that is used commonly throughout northern India is leaching. So that is a practice where actually to flood out the excess salt, you actually over-irrigate it the next round. So you can see that definitely exacerbates it, but that's the fastest fix. In terms of, naturally letting that excess salt kind of decrease, that would take a number of years. So that's a major reason for why that doesn't happen. But yeah, that's the best fix that I have came across. There's also a number of kind of chemical solutions that can be used to decrease salinity. Obviously, yeah, not great for water quality or anything like that, but that's another in terms of fast fix if farmers can afford it. That's what they would do. Yes.
So like in Iowa, I know they try to like rotate crops to help the soil, recover, and so.
Yeah.
Are there any practices like that, or is there any availability, like, to be able to rotate and grow something different, and then?
Yeah. That's a good question. Well, something important to keep in mind is that not like the U.S. In northern India has 3 agricultural seasons, so it is being rotated. It's just that those 3 seasons often farmers are going to be kind of repeating those 3, and so yeah. So you could say crop rotation is happening, but yeah, I would say not enough time since there are 3 agricultural systems jammed into a calendar year. So that's not much time for the soil to rest.
But do they so crop rotation, some of the farmers I know, they grow corn one year and then they grow soybeans another year, and then, so can they change the crop, or is it like they grow rice once, twice, 3 times?
Oh no, so there would be one season in which rice is grown, then different seasons in which, for example, there's fruit grown in the summer season.
Okay.
But yeah, in terms of crop rotation within a specific season, changing it on the years, that wasn't a practice that I came across as very common. So yeah, especially considering, within the Mandi, farmers are building relationships with traders, and so to some extent it kind of makes sense to keep the crop the same because you're establishing a network with your trader, who, if you need your rice stored, you probably would want to be speaking with the same person. So yes, no, that's a little bit of a barrier too. Yeah. Well, I will be around if there's any questions. But if not, thank you so much everyone for coming, and thank you to
At Cornell, we measure the quality of the talk by the number of